East seemed safer, more settlements, less wilderness, but west, deeper into the mountains, called to him with the promise of gold towns and new beginnings. Every town he'd ever lived in had eventually become unbearable. People noticed things about him, the way his gaze lingered too long on other young men, how he never courted the local girls. Whispers would start, then suspicions, then threats. He'd learned to move on before things got dangerous. The pattern had become his life's rhythm: arrive, work, hide, flee. It was safer to be alone, that's what he'd learned. That's what he believed with absolute certainty. A man like him couldn't have what others had: a home, a family, someone to share his life with. Such thoughts were dangerous fantasies that would only lead to a hangman's noose or a bullet. The trading post owner stepped back inside and closed the door with finality. Yates stood alone as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He headed west toward the mountains. If he died out there, at least he'd die free. The storm hit with unexpected ferocity. Within minutes, Yates was soaked through, the path beneath his feet turning to slick mud. The daylight dimmed rapidly under heavy clouds, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. He struggled forward, head down against the driving rain, not certain he was even following the trail anymore. When his boot caught on a half-buried rock, he went down hard, his knee twisting painfully as he fell. The contents of his rucksack spilled across the muddy ground. He scrambled to recover them, but the rushing water carried his mother's Bible away before he could reach it. "No," he cried, lunging after it, only to slip again. Lightning struck a tree not 50 yards away with a deafening crack. The flash momentarily blinded him, and the concussion knocked him backward. Disoriented and in pain, he struggled to his feet, abandoning his scattered possessions. Shelter, he needed to find shelter now. Through the curtain of rain, he spotted a faint light, a cabin perhaps, or a campfire under an overhang. He limped toward it, each step sending sharp pain through his injured knee. The light resolved into a lantern hanging from the eave of a small cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney despite the downpour. Yates staggered the last few yards and collapsed against the door, pounding with the last of his strength. "Hello, anyone there?" "Please." The door opened suddenly, causing him to stumble forward into warm, dry air. Strong hands caught him before he could fall. "Easy there," said a deep voice. "You're half drowned by the look of you." Yates blinked rain from his eyes and found himself staring into the weather-browned face of a man perhaps 5 years his senior. Broad-shouldered and solid, with eyes the color of coffee and a neatly trimmed beard, he wore a simple flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows revealing muscular forearms. "Storm caught me," Yates managed. "I was at the trading post, but—" "Simmons sent you away, didn't he?" The man shook his head. "That old skinflint turns away more folks than he helps. Come on in before you catch your death." Still supporting Yates with one arm, the stranger kicked the door shut against the howling wind and guided him toward a chair by the hearth. "Name's Wade Osborne," the man said. "This here's my place." "Yates Owens," he replied through chattering teeth. "You're shivering something fierce. Those clothes need to come off." Yates stiffened, alarm coursing through him. He'd heard of men who lived alone in the wilderness, who had appetites for company of any kind when isolation grew too heavy, but the cowboy's expression held nothing but practical concern. "I've got dry things you can borrow," Wade continued, turning to a trunk in the corner. "Won't fit perfect, but they'll keep you from freezing." He pulled out a flannel shirt and a pair of worn denim trousers. "I'll step outside while you change." "In this storm?" Yates asked, surprised. Wade smiled slightly. "Porch is covered. I'll check on my horse. Take your time." When the door closed behind Wade, Yates struggled out of his sodden clothes. His knee had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, angry and red. The fire's warmth felt heavenly against his chilled skin. He pulled on the borrowed clothes, which hung loosely on his leaner frame but were blessedly dry. Wade returned a few minutes later, rain dripping from his hat. He hung it on a peg by the door and assessed Yates with a nod. "Better. Now let me see that knee." Yates hesitated. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing if you can't walk on it," Wade said firmly. "I've tended enough injuries out here to know my way around a sprain or break." After a moment's resistance, Yates relented, rolling up the oversized pant leg to reveal his swollen knee. Wade knelt and examined it with gentle but confident hands. His touch was impersonal, clinical even, but Yates had to fight against the unfamiliar feeling of another man's fingers on his bare skin. "Not broken," Wade pronounced. "Bad sprain, though. You won't be walking far for at least a week." He stood and moved to a shelf, selecting a tin of salve and some strips of clean cloth. This will help with the swelling. Yates swallowed hard. A week. I don't have any way to pay you for lodging that long. Wade applied the strong-smelling salve to Yates' knee, his movements efficient but careful. Did I ask for payment? He began wrapping the joint with practiced ease. Winter's coming on. I can use an extra pair of hands around here once you're mended. You can work off your keep. You don't even know me, Yates protested. Wade secured the bandage and looked up, meeting Yates' eyes directly. I know you're hurt and there's a storm and the next trading post is 20 miles from here. That's enough for tonight. Rest up. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow. That night, Yates slept on a pallet near the fire while Wade took the narrow bed behind a curtain in the cabin's single room. Despite the comfort of dry clothes and shelter, Yates slept fitfully, troubled by the forced intimacy of the situation. He'd spent years avoiding prolonged contact with others, particularly men who might notice his carefully hidden nature. Wade seemed straightforward enough, a solitary rancher with a small holding in the mountain foothills. But Yates had learned that seemingly decent men often harbored the greatest hatred for men like him. One wrong look, one careless word, could turn shelter into danger. Better to keep his distance, heal quickly, and move on before he made a mistake. Morning brought clear skies and a throbbing pain in his knee. He awoke to find Wade already up and cooking breakfast, bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan, coffee bubbling in a pot at the edge of the rekindled fire. Thought you might sleep till noon, Wade said, glancing over. Storms passed but left plenty of damage, roofs leaking in the corner and a section of fence is down. Your knee any better? Yates tentatively flexed it, wincing. Not much. Wade nodded as if this confirmed his expectations. You'll stay put today. I've got to round up any cattle that scattered during the storm. Can you handle stoking the fire and resting that leg? I'm not an invalid, Yates said, more sharply than he'd intended. Wade raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Suit yourself, but if you make it worse trying to prove something, you'll be laid up even longer. He handed Yates a plate with bacon and a hunk of cornbread. Eat. You're too thin. After breakfast, Wade saddled his horse and rode out to check his small herd. Left alone, Yates took the opportunity to examine the cabin more closely. It was simple but well built, with tight joints that kept out the mountain winds. A bookshelf surprised him. Wade had nearly 24 volumes, from practical manuals on animal husbandry to dog-eared novels and a book of poetry. The personal touches were few but revealing. A carved wooden horse on the mantel, a colorful quilt on the bed that looked handmade, a daguerreotype in a silver frame showing a younger Wade beside an older couple, parents perhaps. No wife, no children, no sign of a woman's presence at all. The day passed slowly. Yates managed to limp outside to the well for fresh water, then set about sweeping the cabin floor and organizing the dishes that had been left to dry. He found Wade's journal but resisted the temptation to read it, respecting the man's privacy even as curiosity gnawed at him. Wade returned at dusk, mud-splattered and weary but satisfied. Found all but 2 of the steers, he reported, dropping his hat on the table. They'll turn up. He paused, looking around the tidied cabin. You've been busy. Least I could do, Yates said with a shrug. Better than sitting uselessly all day. Appreciate it, Wade rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness. How's the knee? Better if I don't put weight on it. Wade nodded, then gestured to a battered checkerboard on a high shelf. Know how to play. They passed the evening with checkers, the howling wind outside making the cabin feel more secure, almost cozy. Wade proved to be a shrewd player but not unwilling to share his strategies when Yates asked. Their conversation remained superficial, the weather, the cattle, the distant mining operations in the higher mountains. What brought you out to these parts? Wade asked eventually, jumping one of Yates' pieces and removing it from the board. Yates tensed. The question seemed innocent enough, but he'd learned caution. Just looking for work, he said vaguely. Thought I'd try Denver. You don't strike me as a city man. I'm not particular, Yates replied, studying the board to avoid Wade's gaze. Work is work. Wade seemed to sense his reluctance and changed the subject. That wagon train that left you, they heading to Denver. Yes, I paid for passage, but the wagon master decided I was troublesome. No need to explain the full circumstances. Simmons at the trading post could have put you up. He's got the room. He said he couldn't spare the supplies. Wade snorted. He charges double what things are worth and hoards the rest. But he's the only trading post for miles, so folks have little choice. He made another move on the board, you're king. Days passed, falling into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. As Yates' knee improved, he took on more chores, at first just the cooking and cleaning, then feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, and eventually helping with minor repairs to the cabin. Wade never pushed him to do more than he was capable of, but neither did he treat Yates like a burden. They talked more freely as time passed. Wade had inherited the small ranch from an uncle who died 5 years earlier. Before that, he'd worked cattle drives across 3 territories. He spoke of the cities he'd visited, Denver, Santa Fe, even San Francisco once, with knowledge but little fondness. Too many people, he explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Out here, a man can breathe, can be himself without eyes always judging. Something in his tone made Yates glance over sharply, but Wade's expression revealed nothing beyond contentment with the view. Most men would find it lonely, Yates ventured. Most men can't abide their own company, Wade replied. That's different from being lonely. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling lazily in the still evening air. What about you? You running from something or toward something? Yates stiffened. What makes you think I'm running? Everyone out here is running from something, Wade said mildly. Law, debts, memories, no shame in it. Mountains have a way of helping a man start fresh. After a long silence, Yates spoke carefully. I've never found anywhere that felt right, like I belonged. Always felt like I was wearing a costume, playing a part that didn't fit. Wade nodded slowly. I understand that better than you might think. 2 weeks after the storm, Yates' knee had healed enough that he could walk without pain, though long distances still caused it to ache. There was no logical reason to stay any longer. The next supply wagon would pass the trading post in less than a week, according to Wade's reckoning of the schedule. I should be moving on, Yates said one morning as they mucked out the small stable where Wade kept his horse and a mule. I've imposed on your hospitality too long. Wade paused, leaning on his pitchfork. You've more than earned your keep, he said, and winter's coming on, not the best time to be traveling, especially with that knee still tender. I need to find proper work, save some money. I could use help through the winter, Wade said, his tone carefully casual. It's hard managing alone when the snow piles deep. I can't offer much in wages, but room and board and maybe a small stake come spring. Yates felt a curious mixture of relief and alarm. The thought of staying was tempting, the cabin was comfortable, the work satisfying, and Wade's company unexpectedly pleasant. But the longer he stayed, the greater the risk that Wade might notice things about him, might recognize the nature he worked so hard to conceal. I'll think on it, he said finally. That night, unable to sleep, Yates slipped outside to sit on the porch. The mountains loomed dark against a sky scattered with stars, the air sharp with the promise of frost by morning. He heard the cabin door open behind him but didn't turn. Can't sleep, Wade asked, settling beside him on the rough-hewn bench, just thinking. Wade nodded, seemingly content with silence. After several minutes, he spoke again. You remind me of someone I knew years back, on a cattle drive to Wyoming. Something in his voice made Yates turn to look at him. Wade was staring out at the darkness, his profile illuminated only by starlight. Young fella, not much older than you are now, good with horses, kept to himself mostly. Wade paused, then continued more softly. We became friends of a sort, used to sit up nights like this, talking, looking at the stars. Yates felt a tightness in his chest, a warning to tread carefully. What happened to him? Some of the other drivers, they got suspicious. The way we were together, Wade's voice remained even, but Yates could hear the effort it took. They caught him alone one night, beat him so bad I hardly recognized him, left him for dead by a creek. Yates' mouth went dry. Dead he? He lived, I found him, got him to a doctor in the next town, but after that he rode away, said it wasn't safe for either of us to be seen together. Wade turned then, meeting Yates' eyes directly. Never saw him again, never stopped wondering what became of him. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. Yates felt exposed, as if Wade had somehow seen straight through the careful walls he'd built. Why are you telling me this? He asked, barely above a whisper. Because I've spent 15 years since then living careful, always alone, always watching my words, my glances. Wade's gaze was steady, and I'm tired of it. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Yates' heart hammered against his ribs. This moment feared and fled from it his entire adult life. The moment of recognition, of exposure. It had always meant danger before. "I should go," he said, starting to rise. Wade's hand on his arm stopped him, the touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to run, not from me." "You don't understand," Yates said, though a part of him suspected that Wade understood all too well. "Men like me, we don't get to stay in one place, we don't get to have normal lives." "What's normal?" Wade asked, living alone, hiding, always afraid. His hand slid down to capture Yates, a bold move under the open sky, even with no witnesses for miles. "Or maybe it's finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and deciding that's worth the risk." Yates couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Wade's hand was warm against his, calloused from years of ranch work, but holding his with unmistakable tenderness. "I've never," Yates began, then faltered. "I mean, I've always known I was different, but I've never let myself." "I know," Wade said quietly. "Neither have I, not since Thomas, the man I told you about. But when I found you half drowned on my doorstep, something inside me recognized something in you, like finding a reflection in still water. The world seemed to hold its breath." Yates knew he stood at a crossroads more significant than any trail junction. The safe path was to pull away, to maintain the distance that had protected him for so long. But the other path, the one Wade was offering, promised something he'd never dared to hope for, understanding, acceptance, perhaps even. "I'm scared," Yates admitted, the words barely audible. "So am I," Wade replied. "But I'm more scared of spending another 15 years alone than I am of taking this chance with you." Their first kiss was tentative, almost chaste, just the gentle press of lips beneath the vastness of the stars. When they parted, Yates felt dizzy, as if the mountain itself had shifted beneath him. "Stay," Wade whispered, "at least through the winter. We can take it slow, figure things out together." Yates nodded, unable to form words around the emotion swelling in his chest. As autumn deepened toward winter, their relationship grew in the privacy of the isolated cabin. Careful at first, a brush of hands while passing tools, sitting closer by the fire each evening, eventually the hesitant exploration of shared affection behind closed doors. Wade was patient, never pushing beyond what Yates was ready for, treating each new intimacy as the precious gift it was. They established routines that made the small ranch function smoothly, Wade handling the cattle and hunting, Yates taking charge of the garden's last harvest and preserving food for the coming cold months. They worked side by side, repairing the cabin's roof, reinforcing the stable, and cutting enough firewood to last through the deepest snows. But beyond the practicalities, they shared stories, dreams, fears. Wade spoke of his years of isolation, of brief encounters in distant towns that left him feeling emptier than before. Yates described the constant movement of his life, town to town, always watching over his shoulder, never belonging. "I used to think men like us were cursed," Wade said one night as they lay together in the narrow bed, now shared without question, "that we were destined to be alone." "And now?" Yates asked, his head resting on Wade's chest, listening to the steady heartbeat beneath. "Now I think maybe we just need to be braver, find our own way of living." The first heavy snow came in early December, transforming the landscape overnight. They awoke to a world of pristine white, the familiar contours of the ranch made new and strange beneath the blanket of snow. The isolation that had once seemed like a hardship to Yates now felt like a blessing, a protective barrier between their private world and the judgments that waited beyond. That day, as they worked to clear paths to the stable and well, the trading post owner Simmons arrived unexpectedly on a mule, bringing mail and news from the outside world. Wade invited him in for coffee, and Yates tensed, suddenly aware of how the cabin must look to an outsider, one bed instead of two, their clothes hanging together, the unmistakable signs of shared living that went beyond mere convenience. "Nasty business over in Pinetop," Simmons said, warming his hands around the coffee cup. "Two fellows caught in what some might call an unnatural situation. Town ran them out on a rail. One of them nearly died from the beating." Wade's face remained impassive, but Yates saw his knuckles whiten around his own cup. "That so?" Wade asked neutrally. Sheriff didn't do nothing to stop it." Simmons shook his head. "Bible's clear on such things." "Bible says a lot of things," Wade replied evenly, "about judging others and loving thy neighbor too." Simmons gave Wade a sharp look, then glanced at Yates, who busied himself at the stove. "Just passing on the news," he said after a moment. Thought you ought to know what kind of elements might be roaming these parts, cast out from decent society. After he left, the cabin felt colder despite the blazing fire. Yates paced anxiously while Wade sat still, staring into the flames. He suspects, Yates said finally, the way he looked at us. Simmons has always been one to talk more than he thinks, Wade replied. But yes, he might have his suspicions. What if he spreads word? What if others come looking? Wade rose and crossed to where Yates stood, placing steady hands on his shoulders. This is my land, 20 acres, legally deeded. I've lived here 5 years without trouble. But now I'm here, Yates said, the fear he'd held at bay for months surging back. I've brought danger to your door. You've brought life to my door, Wade corrected firmly. Joy, purpose. I won't give that up because Simmons or anyone else might disapprove. But the seed of fear had been planted. In the days that followed, Yates found himself listening for approaching riders, startling at unexpected sounds. The cocoon of safety they'd created suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable to the harsh realities of the world beyond their small valley. Wade noticed the change. You're pulling away, he said one evening as they lay in bed, a careful distance now between them where none had existed before. Don't let fear win, Yates. Not after we've come so far. It's not just fear, Yates insisted. It's facing facts. Men like us don't get happy endings. We get nooses or bullets or being run out of town with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Some do, Wade acknowledged. But not all. There are places, San Francisco, parts of Colorado, where men live quietly together. Confirmed bachelors, they call themselves, business partners, cousins sometimes. Lies, Yates said bitterly. Different kinds of hiding. Not hiding being careful, there's a difference. Wade propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at Yates intently. I refuse to believe our only choices are complete isolation or destruction. The tension between them grew as winter deepened. Though they continued to share the bed and the work of the ranch, something had changed. Yates withdrew into himself, the old habits of self-protection reasserting themselves despite Wade's steady patience. In late January, a blizzard howled down from the mountains, confining them to the cabin for 3 days straight. The forced proximity broke through some of the barriers Yates had erected. With nowhere to retreat to, they were compelled to face each other honestly. I'm afraid of wanting this too much, Yates admitted on the second night, as they huddled near the fire with blankets wrapped around them against the bitter cold that seeped through the cabin's walls despite the blaze. Of believing I can have this, have you, and then losing everything. Wade's expression softened. That's just life, Yates. Everyone who loves risks loss. The only people who never get hurt are the ones who never care deeply about anything or anyone. It's different for us, Yates insisted. Other people don't risk being hanged for who they love. True enough, Wade conceded, but that doesn't mean the love is worth any less. Might mean it's worth more, given what we risk for it. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find drifts higher than a man's head around the cabin. It took 2 days of exhausting work to dig paths to the stable and check on the cattle in the sheltered valley below. Several had not survived the brutal cold. As they worked side by side, the physical labor and shared purpose began to heal the rift between them. By unspoken agreement, they set aside the heavier questions and focused on the immediate needs of survival. At night, they fell into bed too tired for anything but sleep, wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort. Spring arrived late to the high country, but when it came, it transformed their world with startling swiftness. Snow retreated up the mountainsides, wildflowers erupted from the sodden earth, and the cattle grew fat on fresh grass. With the changing season came riders, trappers heading into the high country, prospectors chasing rumors of new strikes, the occasional lawman checking remote settlements. Their privacy, so complete during the isolated winter months, was suddenly threatened from all sides. They developed a careful routine when visitors approached, separate activities, a pallet unrolled beside the fire to suggest Yates slept there, casual references to my ranch hand or my employer depending on who was speaking. It wore on them both, this public pretense after months of private honesty, but beneath the strain, their bond had only grown stronger. They moved in unconscious harmony around each other, communicating with glances and gestures that needed no words. At night, when they were alone again, the relief of dropping the masks was palpable. I've been thinking, Wade said one evening in late May as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, about the future. Yates tensed slightly. The change of seasons had brought back his restlessness, the ingrained instinct to move on before discovery. Though he hadn't spoken of it, he'd caught himself eyeing the horizon, calculating distances to the nearest towns, planning escape routes. There's a parcel of land for sale, Wade continued. Up north near the Wyoming border, 200 acres, good grazing, plenty of water, remote but not so isolated we couldn't get supplies. You're thinking of moving? Yates asked, surprised. I'm thinking of expanding, Wade clarified. This place is too small for the herd I want to build, and, he hesitated, too many people know me here, know I've been alone. The questions are starting, why I keep a ranch hand when I never did before, why we're always together. Yates' throat tightened. I should go. That's not what I'm saying, Wade said firmly. I'm saying we should go together. Fresh start where no one knows either of us. We arrive as partners in a ranching venture, business partners as far as anyone needs to know. You'd leave here, this was your uncle's place. It's just land and logs, Wade said. What matters is what we're building together, the life, the partnership, that can happen anywhere. He reached for Yates' hand, holding it openly despite the fading daylight. I've never asked because I wanted you to stay of your own choice. But now I'm asking, will you come with me, make a life with me? Yates looked at their joined hands, then up at the mountains turning purple in the dusk. The fear was still there, it might always be there, a shadow at the edges of any happiness he found. But alongside it now was something stronger, hope, trust. The belief that perhaps, against all odds, he had found his place in the world. Yes, he said finally, yes, I'll go with you. The summer passed in a flurry of preparations. Wade rode to Denver to arrange the purchase of the new land and the sale of his current property. Yates focused on readying the cabin for its new owners, a young couple with a baby on the way, eager for an established homestead rather than having to build from scratch. They sold what they couldn't take, packed what they could, and prepared for the journey north. Wade purchased a wagon and a second horse for Yates, who had been using the mule. They plotted their route carefully, avoiding larger settlements where possible. As the day of departure approached, Simmons rode up from the trading post, ostensibly to deliver a final package but clearly curious about their plans. Heard you sold up, he said to Wade, eyeing the half-loaded wagon, moving on after all these years. Time for a change, Wade replied easily. Bigger operation up north. Simmons nodded, his gaze sliding to Yates. Both of you going, then? Mr. Owens has proven himself invaluable, Wade said, his tone neutral but his stance subtly shifting to place himself between Simmons and Yates. Good ranch hands are hard to find in these parts. Seems like you found more than a hand, Simmons remarked, his voice taking on an edge. Folks talk, you know, about two men living alone together. Especially when one of them had no good reason to take in a stranger. Yates felt ice form in his veins, but Wade remained outwardly calm. Folks always talk, he replied evenly. Usually when they've got nothing better to do with their time. My business arrangements are my own concern, Simmons. When they violate God's law, they become everyone's concern, Simmons said, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. Wade's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. This is private property, Wade said, his voice carrying in the still night air. State your business or ride on. We know what you are, Simmons spat, what you've been doing up here. It's an affront to God and decent folk. You know nothing about me or Mr. Owens, Wade replied evenly, and what happens on my land is my concern alone. The blacksmith shifted in his saddle. Heard you're leaving, good riddance, I say. Your kind ain't welcome here. Our kind, Wade raised an eyebrow. Ranchers, hard-working men, which kind is that exactly? The momentary uncertainty on the men's faces told Yates they hadn't expected this calm defiance. They'd come expecting shame, denial, perhaps pleading. Wade's steady confidence threw them off balance. Don't play dumb, Simmons growled. We know what you two are to each other. It ain't natural and it ain't right. And yet here we are, Wade replied, harming no one, tending our business, preparing to leave peacefully. Where's the threat that brings 4 armed men to my door in the night? The threat is to decency, the barkeeper exclaimed. To the natural order. I see, Wade's voice remained level, and you've appointed yourselves judges of that order, have you, above the law that says a man's home is his castle. Above the commandment that says, thou shalt not kill. The rancher, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. We ain't here to kill nobody, just to make sure you understand you ain't welcome back ever. And wherever you're going, you'd best keep your situation more private. Yates felt a flicker of hope. These men were angry, disgusted perhaps, but not bent on murder, at least not all of them. They wanted to frighten, to assert their moral superiority, to drive away what they didn't understand. We're leaving at first light, Wade said firmly, as planned, not because of your threats, but because we've chosen to. Now I suggest you ride back to wherever you came from, and let us finish our preparations in peace. For a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate despite Wade's reasoning. The blacksmith's hand twitched toward his holster, and Simmons's face twisted with undisguised hatred. Then the rancher spoke again. Let's go, they'll be gone tomorrow, no need for bloodshed. After all they've done, Simmons protested. It's a sin crying out for punishment. And who appointed you God's executioner? The rancher retorted. I've had my differences with Osborne, but he's always dealt fairly, paid his debts. Helped when the creek flooded 2 springs back, he turned his horse. I've said my piece, I'm riding out. The blacksmith hesitated, then followed. After a moment of indecision, the barkeeper did the same. Left alone, Simmons glared at Wade and Yates. You'll find no welcome anywhere decent people live, he said bitterly. Filth like you deserves whatever comes to it. Good night, Simmons, Wade replied, his rifle now pointed more directly at the trader. Don't come back. After Simmons finally rode away, they retreated inside, bolting the door and extinguishing the lamps to make the cabin appear dark from outside, in case the men returned. We need to leave now, Yates insisted, his heart still racing. They might come back with more men. Wade nodded grimly. You're right, we'll load what we can and go. The rest isn't worth our lives. They worked through the night, loading the wagon by moonlight, taking only what was essential: tools, weapons, clothing, food for the journey, the money Wade had set aside for their new beginning. By false dawn, they were ready. As they prepared to depart, Wade took one last look at the cabin that had been his home for 5 years. I thought I'd feel more leaving this place, he said quietly, but it's just wood and land. What matters is coming with me. The journey north was tense at first. They traveled by day but kept off the main trails where possible, camping far from established routes. At each river crossing, each mountain pass, they watched for pursuit or ambush. But as the miles stretched behind them, the fear gradually subsided. By the time they crossed into Wyoming territory, they had begun to breathe easier, to believe in the possibility of the future they had planned. The land Wade had purchased sight unseen proved better than they had dared to hope, a wide valley nestled between protective ridges, with a clear creek running through its center and plenty of good grazing land. A small cabin stood near the creek, rough but sound enough to serve until they could build something better. As they stood surveying their new domain, Wade slipped his arm around Yates' waist, a gesture that would have been unthinkably dangerous just weeks before. What do you think? He asked. Can you see a life here? Yates looked across the valley to the distant mountains, then back to the man beside him. The journey had changed something fundamental within him. The fear that had ruled his life for so long, the belief that men like him were destined for loneliness or destruction, had been replaced by a tentative faith in possibility. Not safety, perhaps, the world was still the world, but the chance to build something genuine, something lasting. I can, he said simply, with you. They unloaded the wagon together, arranging their possessions in the small cabin, already planning expansions and improvements. As the sun set on their first day in their new home, they sat on the rough-hewn porch steps, shoulders touching. No regrets, Wade asked quietly. Yates considered the question seriously. He thought of the trading post where he'd been abandoned, the storm that had driven him to Wade's door, the winter that had given them time to discover each other, the confrontation that had forced them to flee. The path that had brought them here had not been easy or straight. No regrets, he answered finally. Everything, even the hardest parts, led us here together. Wade smiled, taking Yates' hand openly under the vast Wyoming sky. Then welcome home, partner, welcome home. As darkness settled over their valley, they remained side by side, watching the first stars appear. 2 men who had found in each other what the world had told them they could never have: acceptance, understanding, love. The future held no guarantees. There would be challenges, perhaps dangers, certainly hard work. but for the first time in his life, Yates faced that future not with fear but with hope. He had been abandoned once at a trading post, lost and alone. But in that moment of greatest vulnerability, he had found shelter with a patient cowboy, and in that shelter, against all expectations, he had found home.